promises in fulfillment all over my life, all over my life. Help me remember when I'm weak. Fear may come and fear will leave. You lead my heart to victory. You are my strength, and you always will be. I see the evidence of your goodness all over my life, all over my life. I see the promises in fulfillment all over my life, all over my life. See the cross, the empty grave, the evidence is endless. All my sin rolled away because of you, oh Jesus. See the cross, the empty grave, the evidence is endless. All my sin rolled away because of you, oh Jesus. I see the evidence of your goodness all over my life, all over my life. I see the promises in fulfillment all over my life, all over my life. I see the evidence of your goodness all over my life, all over my life. I see the promises in fulfillment all over my life, all over my life. See the cross, the empty grave, the evidence is endless. All my sin rolled away because of you, oh Jesus. See the cross, the empty grave, the evidence is endless. All my sin rolled away because of you, oh Jesus. Why should I fear? The evidence is here. Why should I fear? The evidence is here.
Amen.
Ready, Blaze?
Wandering through the night, wanting a place to hide this weary soul, this vagabonds. And I tried with all my might, but I just can't win the fight. I'm slowly drifting, a vagabond. And just when I ran out of road, I met a man I didn't know. He told me that I was not alone. Oh, he picked me up, turned me around, placed my feet on solid ground. I thank the Master, I thank the Savior, because he healed my heart, changed my name, forever free. I'm not the
choice but to believe. My doubts are burning like ashes in the wind. So long to my old friend, burden and bitterness. You just keep moving, you ain't welcome here. From now till I walk the streets of gold, I sing about how you saved my soul. This wayward son has found his way back. Oh, oh, oh. He picked me up, he turned me around, he placed my feet on solid ground. I thank the Master, I thank the Savior, because he healed my heart, changed my name, forever free. I'm not the same. I thank the Master, I thank the Savior. Oh, I thank God. Hail us another one. I am free. I am free. I am free.
Come on, guys, let's sing it out this morning.
I am free. I am free.
Are you guys free?
I am. Hail us another one. I am free. I am
If not, we're
free.
gonna sing it till you
I
pay it.
am
Come on.
free.
Hail us another one. I am free. I am free. I am free. Hail us another one. I am free. I am free. I am free. Hail us another one. I am free. I am free. I am free. Come on. Hail us another one. I am free. I am free. I am free. Hail us another one. I am free. I am free. I am free. He picked me up. He turned me around. He placed my feet on solid ground. I thank the Master. I thank the Savior, because he healed my heart, changed my name, forever free. I'm not the same. I thank the Master. I thank the Savior. Oh, I thank God.
That's fun. This is for the lost and lonely, for the broken and afraid. This is for those who are hurting. Hope and help is on the way. In these battles of addiction, fear is chasing after me. Whatever trouble I am facing, I will lift my hands and sing.
Come on. 'Cause I believe in a miracle power, in a wonder-working God. 'Cause I'm filled with the Holy Spirit, working wonders in my heart. I belong to a loving Father. I'm a friend of Christ, His Son. When it feels like I won't sing it and we say it out loud than when we just think it. Here we go. And I may not know what a day may bring, but I know who brings the day. And on the darkest night, when I cannot see, and still my soul will say, and I may not know what a day may bring, but I know who brings the day. And on the darkest night, when I cannot see, still my soul will say, my soul will say, yeah, I believe in a miracle power, in a wonder-working God. Come on.
I am filled with the Holy Spirit, working wonders in my heart.
I belong to a loving Father. I'm a friend of Christ, His Son. When it feels like I won't make it,
I call on Jesus.
Hey! That's right. In the middle of the night when things seem so dark and so long before that day breaks, all you guys got to do is call on Jesus, man. That's right. Your soul knows it. Just tell your head that. Alrighty. Let's see if I can remember the announcements this morning. So next Sunday is the groups are going to Vandegreft for the park. I think, what is it, Kennedy Park? Taking the inflatables and food and all that fun stuff. Hold on. Okay, still getting over that pneumonia, bronchitis stuff, and singing that gives me a little shorter breath. But yeah, so next week is in the park. So if that's your group, just remember wear your shirts and all that. If it gets rained out, they will tell you, I think it's by like 12:30, so before you guys leave if they have to reschedule. On the 28th, Sunday? What day is the 28th? Anybody? Saturday? Okay. 28th is a work day. So they're really going to focus on outside. So bring dirty clothes. If you guys want to come, if you can't physically do like some of the labor, trust me, there's a lot of stuff to do. So if your heart is saying, I want to help with that, but you're afraid just, maybe to be outside and all that stuff, trust me, there's lots to do. So if you're feeling that call to help, please come. We need lots of help for that. And then also August 5th is the Back 40 Back 40 Leadership Conference up at Summit Church, if you guys want to go. So if you're feeling one called to leadership, you need to be there. If you're already in leadership, you need to be there. So talk with Pastor and Bethany when they come back so that we can get everybody signed up that wants to go and needs to go. It is also the day of the Rock the Block. It is the same day as Rock the Block that is put on by Habitats for Humanity. So if you also want to maybe do that instead of the Back 40 conference, just let, again, Pastor or Bethany, probably Bethany because she does more of the outreach, know, and we can get you guys in the right spot, in with the right people, so because that's not put on by us, that is Habitats for Humanity. But if you don't know what that is, they are trying to help people in Apollo that can't maybe physically paint houses or do some yard work, fix fences, porches, that kind of stuff, to help kind of facelift Apollo. So those are those 3 things. Also today, I already heard the first service, which it was really, really awesome. But we have Pastor's brother, Rick, who's going to give us a good history lesson and really nail it home as to God's evidence all through this world. So if you guys want to give him a round of applause, thank you.
So good morning. You can probably tell by looking at me, I don't look like Terry. But we are indeed, I have more hair. He's younger than I am, but I still have more hair. But I keep God busy because he said the very hairs in your head are numbered, and I lose them at a pretty regular rate, so he has to keep tabs on me all the time. But the reason I'm here today, of course, you know, my brother Terry's up in Maine, and he asked in his absence if I would come and share some of the things about creation and the flood story. Favorite topic of mine. People in my ministry know me, know that apart from Jesus, my favorite book of the Bible is Genesis. The whole story rests on a foundation. That foundation is Genesis. Jesus came because of what happened in Genesis. So I want to take you back to the Bible because what I'm finding true in our generation is the book of Genesis under attack. It's under attack in our public schools. The target audience is kids. It's under attack in our colleges. It's under attack in our churches. The theological seminaries are ignoring a lot of the book of Genesis, pretty much recommending to their students that they start in Genesis chapter 11. Ignore Genesis chapter 1 through chapter 10. So we're going to go in that forbidden territory called Genesis 1 through chapter 10. So but I'll show you some of the evidence out there for creation and the flood. And without further ado, I'll kind of walk you through the slides. Sometimes I get ahead of myself a little bit and have to retract and go back and look at it again. But according to God's Word, there was a beginning. There were not multiple beginnings. There was a beginning. God has been from everlasting to everlasting. The beginning he references is speaking of us and our beginning and how we were brought into God's eternity and what was his purpose for our being there. Why does he have us here? That's all embodied in his vision of what he wanted the world to be at the beginning. He didn't have anything to work with, had no models. He only had his own vision, so to speak. So all this is out of the wisdom of God. But it reads in Genesis 1:1, in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. John describes it in the New Testament, saying, in the beginning was the Word was with God, and the Word was God. The same was in the beginning with God. So I want to talk about the beginning, but I don't want to stay there because I want to show you how we went from the beginning to where we are today and an event that occurred that changed the whole landscape of the world and everything in it. And that would be Noah's flood. But how long did it take God to make the world? According to his own testimony, and I'll throw a little something out there. Didn't call this out in the first service, but I'll call it out here. When God said what he said in Genesis chapter 1 about his creative work, there was nobody there to hear it. Did you ever stop and think about that? There's nobody there to hear it. But what he was doing was establishing our faith in what God says, even though we weren't there to hear it. So, when we come in, how long did it take? It took 6 days. I took a little bit out of the end of Genesis 1:31 into chapter 2, verse 2. And you'll see God saw everything that he had made, and behold, it was very good. And the evening and the morning were the 6th day. So everything was made by the conclusion of the 6th day. Exodus 20, verse number 11, God is talking to Moses on a mountain, giving him the law, choosing Israel to be his people. And one of the laws he gives is to honor the Sabbath day and keep it holy. Remember it, keep it holy. But then he actually explains why he wants them to keep a Sabbath day. And he says, for in 6 days the Lord made heaven and earth. This is out of God's mouth to Moses, the sea and all that is in them. So God's telling Moses, some many years after this creative act took place, that he did it in 6 days, and that was to be a rule that the people of Israel were to follow. God rested on the seventh day. That became the Sabbath day. So, the question that comes to mind, though, was there anything before that? Because when you get into the creative narrative in Genesis 1 and 2 and 3, and you get into Noah's flood, which is the part they're saying we should ignore, there's a lot of questions in terms of, well, maybe there was, because we see an evolutionary theory out there that's saying that the earth is billions of years old. We have the Bible saying that God did it in 6 days, and when he did it was about 6,000 years ago. Was there anything before what we call our beginning? Was there another beginning somewhere? Was there 2 beginnings, 3 beginnings? No, God calls out one. Hebrews 11, when it talks about faith, says, through faith we understand that the worlds were framed by the word of God, so that the things which are seen were not made of things which do appear. God didn't do a makeover when we came into existence. We were the beginning in his eternity. He's been there from everlasting to everlasting. We came into the picture when he started this work. In Isaiah 45:12, he says, I have made the earth and created man upon it. I, even my hands, have stretched out the heavens, and all their hosts have I commanded. God's claiming to himself sole ownership of everything you see, hear, smell, taste, feel. Everything that your 5 senses can perceive, God made it. And he's telling you that. I and I alone. We were created on day 6, according to Genesis 1:27 and 31. God created man in his own image, and then it concludes with, and there was evening and there was morning, a 6th day. But people don't believe the story. That goes all the way into theological seminaries. They don't believe the story. That's why they tell you to jump ahead to Genesis 11. Why did they challenge the story? Well, some of the arguments that are out there are things like, we read in the Bible, Methuselah lived to be 969 years, so maybe a day wasn't really a day, because nobody can live 969 years. I can tell you personally, I wouldn't want to live 969 years. But dinosaurs lived millions of years ago. So how can the earth be thousands of years old if dinosaurs lived millions of years ago? Dinosaurs couldn't have fit in the ark. Can't believe that flood story, because dinosaurs are so big they wouldn't have been able to squish them in the ark. So that can't be true. The geological column, or the fossil record underneath this, contradicts the Bible narrative. And evolutionary science has proven that the earth is billions of years old. So you can't trust the Bible. It says 6,000 years, said everything was made in 6 days. But we know, according to evolutionary scientists, that this thing is billions of years old. Well, that's a pretty big discrepancy. Question is, who was back there to tell the story? God was. God tells you the story in Genesis. He was the only one there. Again, nobody's there to hear it. He was telling you everything he did. But as far as Christians are concerned, when you think about evolution, it has influenced the thinking of the Christian community. That's a graph from the Pew Research Center, where they talked about, as questioning Christians and adults in general, and he categorized it by religion. Did a supreme being guide evolution, or was evolution due to natural processes? Both of them, of course, including evolution. And you'll see there, white mainline Protestants, 78% net, believe that either a supreme being guided evolution or evolution was due to natural processes. But in both cases, that was a new word. In both cases, evolution was the underlying premise. Even among white evangelical Protestants, you'll see 27% down there still look at evolution as being fact. There are some biblical warnings out there to the Christian community. God knew this was coming, didn't surprise him. God doesn't react, God plans. God knew this was coming. So he threw some scriptures out there so we'd be aware. 2 Peter 3:5, for this they willingly are ignorant of, that by the word of God the heavens were of old, and the earth standing out of the water and in the water. Paul wrote to Timothy, O Timothy, keep that which is committed to thy trust, avoiding profane and vain babblings and oppositions of science, falsely so called. Can I put it in my words? Phony science. Colossians 2:8, take care that no one takes you away by force through man's wisdom and deceit. Interesting word there, huh? In deceit, going after beliefs of men and the theories of the world. The word world right there, or the theories of the world that you'll see in the actual Greek language, it means theories about the origins of things. What's evolution? A theory about the origins of things. Now, the Bible didn't put the word evolution in there. Didn't exist yet. But he was telling you it's coming. There's another warning there in Romans chapter 1, verse 20 and 28. You'll see some of the words I called out there. He said, the invisible things of him from the creation of the world are clearly seen. So he's talking about creation back in the New Testament. Being understood by the things that are made, even his eternal power and Godhead, so that they are without excuse. Verse 28 says, even as they did not like to retain God in their knowledge, God gave them over to reprobate mind. So we chose not to retain God in our knowledge. We chose to come up with our own ideas, our own wisdom. And there's a lot of deceit out there based on that wisdom. We call it science. But this is more, evolution is more, what I refer to as science by consensus and intimidation. Let's all get together and say this is what it was. Let's all agree. Don't really need evidence because we all agree and buy into the same thing. But there's some things to know about the evolutionary theory. But before we get there, we're going to talk about the age of the earth and the challenge about the time frame. A lot of people question the duration of the days spoken of in Genesis chapter 1. Were they really 24-hour days? They use scriptures like this. Psalm 90 verse 4 speaks and says, 1,000 years in your sight are but yesterday. 2 Peter 3:8, I suppose, probably quoting close to Psalm 90. He says, one day is with the Lord as 1,000 years, and 1,000 years is one day. What that's really supposed to imply, it's talking about the return of Jesus Christ and his judgment on the earth and how he's postponing it because he's merciful, long-suffering toward us. So it says to him, time doesn't matter. We take that and say, well, 1,000 years could be a day, and a day 1,000 years. Well, let's move it to some other Bible stories and see how well it fits. How long was Jonah in the belly of a whale? 3 days or 3,000 years? How long did the children of Israel walk around the walls of Jericho? 7 days or 7,000 years? See, it doesn't fit other spots in the Bible, and we don't have justification in our mind to apply it to Genesis chapter 1. People say, well, a day can be an era in time. It can mean kind of an age. So God was talking about ages, yet God himself in Genesis defines the parameters for each day that he speaks of, as the evening and the morning were the first day. The evening and the morning were the second day. The evening and the morning were the third day, etc., 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 all through the sixth day. And the Sabbath day in duration, how long was that? It was a 24-hour day. And God put that alongside the 6 days he made creation, the seventh day I rested, so honor it. That was out of God's mouth directly to Moses. Why the unbelief in the Genesis account is because the evolutionary lie has undermined the Christian's faith in the authority of Scripture. It's got bigger. Truth behind the evolutionary theory. Evolution denies the existence of God. It works on the premise that nobody created the heavens and the earth. There is no God. It happened on its own. The intelligence is in itself. It's through random chance, mutation, time, and scientists can see the complexity that's in the things that exist, and they try and determine, well, to get from a simple life form where life happened, which they cannot explain how life happened. Well, when life happened, it was really simple, and then it evolved over eons of time, millions and billions of years, to get to the level of complexity that's in creation today. Things mutated. When it mutated, it would decide what was good for its survival and what was maybe not so good. So it kept the things that were good and cast off the things that were bad, because it could figure it out. I always think to myself things like, well, why did we then evolve eyeballs? How do we know there was things to see? Why did we evolve a nose? How do we know there are things to smell? Because you could have seen it, didn't know it carried a scent. Maybe you evolved your nose first, you could smell it, but you didn't know what it looked like. There was smells of pizza wafting through the air, and you wanted to see what pizza looked like. Yeah. Yeah. You think about it, how did it figure out what it needed? Unless it had the parts and pieces to already perceive the things it thought it needed. Everything had to happen together. Yeah, and now there's other parts of this I don't go into for sake of time, but yeah, it's a tough subject to cover in a short time frame. But when you look at the evolutionary theory, how does it impact the Bible? How does it impact the gospel? According to the gospel, God created man. Man sinned against God. That was through Adam and Eve in a garden. And God sent his Son to save man because we sinned. He wanted us back. He loved us. He wanted to redeem us. Well, if we take this story and take God out of the equation, because God didn't exist and everything happened on its own, it did it by its own control, its own mechanisms. Well, then you take out God created man. Well, here's just it. If God didn't create man, then man couldn't sin against God. Well, you got to take that out of the picture. Well, if man didn't sin against God, then he doesn't need a Savior, because there's nobody to be accountable to. So you can take Jesus out of the story because he couldn't be the Son of God. God couldn't have sent his Son to save the world because there's no God and there was no sin to save us from. So you take that out of the story. Attacking Genesis 1 through 10 destroys the entire gospel narrative. You become God because you evolved to be the highest life form on this planet. Yeah. Sound like that came from somewhere, because there was an angel that God created by the name of Lucifer. And Lucifer wanted to exalt his throne to be like the Most High. And when he came to Eve in the Garden of Eden, came to Eve and said, you know what? You ought to eat of the fruit of that tree. Because if you eat of the fruit of that tree, see, God's hiding that from you, because you eat of the fruit of that tree, you'll become like gods, knowing good and evil. He hasn't given up on his quest. He's deceiving mankind to think the same way he does and coming to the same result. He got thrown out of heaven and will be rejected from heaven if we think we don't need God. And they're out to destroy that gospel narrative. God doesn't exist. It's atheism disguised as science. Or shall we say the science of atheism. Then they throw out all kind of fancy pictures, because we all know that a picture is worth 1,000 words. So if we put enough artistry out there, we can illustrate our theory, and that'll just sell the deal that much more. So when we put it in the kids' books and they look at that stuff, they'll be convinced because, wow, they even got pictures that show it all happening. We come up with pictures as far as mankind. How did we evolve? We evolved from monkeys. So you show a monkey on one end of the spectrum and a man on the other end of the spectrum. The only thing they don't tell you in that spectrum, none of those other ones exist. Except the chimpanzee, which they have walking upright, which they rarely do. If you ever looked at their feet configuration, it's pretty nasty looking, and they walk kind of bow-legged, and then they have to get back down because they can't walk far. But you'll see we got bigger and smaller and bigger and smaller and bigger and smaller and bigger and smaller. We couldn't decide how big we wanted to be. But none of that stuff's in the fossil record. So if that one didn't work, let's go with one that's in color. Do a close-up. Put that in the book, because that'll be even more convincing. Because then you can see how we went from a monkey to a man. Except none of the transitional species are anywhere to be found. Well, let's look at the bone structure. That's got to be really, really telling. So they go from a gibbon to an orangutan to a chimpanzee to a gorilla to us. But we couldn't decide how tall, how fat or thin. We were confused. But I like the last picture because it shows all these animals that don't ordinarily stand on their hind legs, making it look like they do stand on their hind legs when they don't. That's not the way they ambulate. But then I like the last picture of us to make us look more like them. Let me ask you this, how many of you stand like this? That's how I get around. So I want to talk about Noah's flood and the fossil record. When you get to creation, we look at the things the way they are, and in the middle of God's creation and where we are today, there was a flood where God judged the world. Around the globe, in ancient cultures, there are flood stories in every ancient culture out there. How did they get it? Well, there were those that came off of the ark, the three sons of Noah, Ham, Seth, and Japheth. They all lived a pretty long time because lifespans had not shortened by that time, and Seth lived all the way up to where Jacob would have been. So he could have told his story to a lot of people. You could actually go ask somebody a question about what the flood was like for hundreds of years. Wow. Then God came down to the Tower of Babel because they decided to build a tower to heaven. Mankind was of one language, and doesn't tell you why they were building it, but I suspect after they heard all the stories of God wiping everybody out and drowning them in a great flood, well, let's build a tower big enough so if we want to run and hide, we can get way up there. And then he won't drown us. But we don't know for sure. But one thing that's missing in the imagery we have about Noah's flood is where I'd like to focus our attention today, and that's on flood mud. I survived the Johnstown flood of 1977. That was the year I graduated. I was in construction, and we spent a lot of time digging through mud after the flood had ended. And that was a teeny-weeny flood in a little teeny-weeny place on a great big map of a globe. You go on to get yourself out a globe, spin it around, come to the United States, go to Pennsylvania, see if you can find Johnstown on there. We still exist. We were not wiped out in the flood. We're still there. See if you can find Spring Church. Get a map of Pennsylvania that isn't there to teach you how to drive across Pennsylvania and map out the highways, just shows the major towns and stuff. See if Spring Church is on there. Johnstown usually isn't. I tell people when I go around, we're from Johnstown. If I'm out of the area and they say, where's Johnstown? Well, it's near Pittsburgh. It's kind of between Pittsburgh and Harrisburg. You have to kind of pick out some bigger cities that they might be familiar with because we're so small. So we have this teeny-weeny spot on the map that had a flood, wiped out a lot of stuff. But we're not talking about a teeny-weeny flood. We're talking about a global, catastrophic flood that covered the entire planet. Every little speck on the planet was impacted by it. And it was huge, it was massive, and it was catastrophic. But when you look at Noah's flood imagery, that flood mud is rarely brought into the imagery. This is the kind of stuff we put in Sunday school books. This is the kind of stuff you see when you look up Noah's flood. A cute little ark on nice clear blue water, a couple dolphins swimming by, smiling faces. This is great. They're not in the ark, they're outside of it because there's no threats out there. Then we show the dispensing of the animals from the ark. Everything's clean, green and vegetative, and there's something missing there, though, that you'll see noticeably absent. There's no indication that there were any dinosaurs getting off that ark. Why? Well, because dinosaurs lived 65 million years ago. So we don't want to put dinosaurs on there. They pre-existed that. Not in God's narrative. God made all the land animals on the sixth day of creation. Made them with man. And God actually says that in His Word. Says that to Job. Speaking of behemoth, a particular species of dinosaur, he says, whom I made with you. Yeah. Nice clear blue water there, even after the flood, such a peaceful place. Some of the pictures of the ark will actually get a little more dramatic to make the water look a little disturbed. The ark's a little bit bigger, but if you notice, the elephants and the giraffes, they're up on the deck of the ark. Now, what that really means, or it implies, is they were too big to fit inside the ark. And if an elephant and a giraffe can't fit in the ark, there ain't no way dinosaurs are fitting in there. They were much bigger than elephants and giraffes. Further reinforcing that visual picture, because again, a picture's worth 1,000 words. Down in Kentucky, they build an ark using the Bible specifications. Now that's a little bit bigger. If you look on there, you'll see some vehicles beside it. Close enough, you probably even some people if you can see that far away. That's truly the size of the ark. Now here's a question about the animals in the ark. God's intent was to save all the kinds of animals that were on not the species, the kinds of animals that were on the planet at the time of the flood. His intent was then that they would be multiply abundantly, breed abundantly, be fruitful, multiply. So he was trying to, when they came off the ark, they were to have lots of offspring to repopulate the planet. So in choosing candidates to put on the ark, do you choose grandma and grandpa? Or do you choose the young'uns? Who's most likely to be able to fulfill God's intent to be fruitful and multiply? I would have to speculate that God picked the younger animals because they had a longer lifespan and greater potential to have offspring. If you're grandma and grandpa in here, when's the last time you had kids? You know, you reach an age and say, I'm done with that. Did my part. So he put younger animals on there so that they could fulfill his intent, and that was to be fruitful and multiply. The largest dinosaur egg that they have yet found in the fossil record is actually only slightly larger than a football. So those great big dinosaurs you see in the museums, they squeezed into a little tiny package when they were born and could easily have gone on the ark, depending on the age of their maturity. The ark wasn't designed to transport its passengers to a destination, but to survive the raging waters of a cataclysmic flood. It didn't have a steerage. There was no rudder. It just wanted to float. It can't roll it over. You don't want it to sink. So it would be designed to save life. That's all it was there for. It didn't care which direction it went. It just had to float. That was its whole intent. God's intent with the flood was to destroy what he'd made. And the Genesis 6:7 says, I will destroy man whom I created from the face of the earth, both man and beast, and the creeping thing and the birds of the air. Everything, he goes on later and says, everything that breathes out of its nostrils. So everything on the land breathes air. Air-breathing animals were to die, be destroyed. Now what's interesting, the word destroy exists in Genesis 6:7. In the Hebrew, makah, which is what's used there to translate destroy, throughout the remainder of the Bible is primarily translated as blotted out. Well, here's a way to think of it. Back then they had parchment paper or animal skins. That's what they wrote on. And their writing implements did not come with erasers. So in order to cover it up, you would cover it up. You'd blot it out. You'll see things throughout the Old Testament. Moses, when he's talking to God about the sins of Israel and they're creating a golden calf, he goes before God and says, God, don't blot their name out. Blot my name out of your book. Use the same word. Interesting. Blot out, cover up. What did he cover up with? Water. No, he covered them up with mud. Flood mud. We don't see that in the imagery, so we think crystal clear blue waters. We think a nice floating ark on a calm sea. That's not the flood. The start of the flood, God describes what happens that sets off the flood and continued through the duration of the flood until he actually reaches a point where he says, and at that point he shut up the fountains of the deep. That was like 150 days later that he shut up the fountains of the deep. So God was having tectonic activity, continents dividing, tsunamis sweeping over the land, rain falling from heaven. This was a very, very, very violent account, and he details it in the book of Genesis. You'll see things, Genesis 7:11, the fountains of the great deep broken up, windows of the heaven opened. In Genesis chapter 1, he describes creation of a firmament where he divides the waters above the firmament from the waters below the firmament, that air space. He called it heaven. So the waters above and below. If he lets go the windows of heaven and it starts to rain, he's pouring out the water from those above the firmament. It says, Genesis 7:18, the waters prevailed, increased greatly. The ark went upon the face of the waters. The waters prevailed exceedingly, covered the high hills. Even the mountains were covered up to, in translates to English, it was 18 cubits or 25 feet above the highest mountains. Looked something like this. Volcanic activity, molten lava encountering water, violence, tsunamis. That's a very, very small scale. That's just one tiny one on this overall globe that we live on. Tsunamis raged across the land. You think about the animals, they talk about the geological column or this fossil record that's under the ground, and they say the least complex, the oldest antique ones, they're way down in the bottom, and then life goes on to evolve throughout the geological column. But in truth, think about where they lived. Those living in the lowest lying areas were the first to go. Those that ran the slowest were the first to go. Those even on the bottom of the ocean, since the waters were filled with sediment, and that sediment settled. If you're crawling along the bottom and volumes of sediment are coming down in the ocean, you're getting buried under the sediment. So, tsunamis swept across the lands, and truly the color of the water would look more like that than what you see in that ark imagery. That's true flood waters. So when I looked at the artistry associated with Noah's flood, I found one image that actually depicted the watercolor correctly. The rest of them all showed as blue. Flood mud turns into rock. It's called sedimentary rock. And 70% of the earth is covered with sedimentary rock. That includes sandstone, limestone, shale, and pumice. They cover our entire Earth's surface on the land mass. Said 70% of the earth is covered by that type of rock. Sedimentary rock is formed via erosion, that takes water and sediment, deposition, or dropping it off somewhere, compaction under pressure, and cementation. So compaction under pressure, let's talk about that a little bit. Here's an illustration that you'll find if you look up lithification online. Lithification is the process. You'll see the water up there washing dirt off the land into the sea, and under there you'll see the sedimentation, and you'll see the lithification under the weight of the water, which is providing the compaction. Well, how much water was in the flood? The current pressure at the deepest point in the ocean, as scientists have been able to discover to this point, is 7.5 tons per square inch. That would compact me. We saw that sub that they just took down to look at the Titanic only a few weeks ago that imploded. At that depth, there was 6 tons of pressure per square inch, squashed the sub. Floodwaters covered the earth for over a year and were over 25 feet above the highest mountains during much of the duration of the flood. Of course, if Mount Everest were in existence at the time, it raises up 29,032 feet above sea level. The pressure at the bottom of the waters had to be pretty tremendous. But there was flood evidence on land, because if a flood occurs on the land, the evidence is going to be on the land. It's under your feet. People go looking for Noah's Ark. Can we find that 4,000-year-old wood structure somewhere sitting on a mountainside? Wood kind of deteriorates. So there's some that say they found it, some that say they didn't, but I don't think they're looking for the right thing. The evidence is under your feet. It's in the sedimentary rock. That's God's photo album. That's where he captured all the life that existed at the time. And when we dig it up, we get to find it and see what kind of animals existed back then. And it was not only dinosaurs. That's the ones we put in the museums because that's what brings the fans. But there was other stuff in the rock. The flood mud bent and swirled. There's images all over the internet. And when you go to Google and do a search, so I went into the public domain and in the free to share and use domains and picked up a few pictures. But rock doesn't bend. But yet all over the world there is evidence of bending. It had to be fluid, had to be soft to bend. And the story we looked at there in Genesis, where it talks about the waters prevailing at the end of the flood, it actually, a Hebrew word in there means to whirl or swirl. So they were not only rocking back and forth, they were spinning around and moving. Yeah, that looks to me like some whirling, swirling sediment gone on in a lot of these landscapes, and this is all over the world. It encapsulated boulders in the flood mud. That's not layers that occurred over millions of years, and that rock just sat there and said, go ahead, cover me up. That's actually, if you look at them, they were surrounded, bent rock around them, or bent sediment around them. It surrounded trees. These are not trees that fell over and died and decomposed and went back to being soil. These are trees that were surrounded by something that flowed around them and covered them up while they were still standing upright. Dinosaurs, animals, and even people walked in the flood mud, and it became the sediment they walked in became sedimentary rock. There's dinosaur tracks all over the world that have been fossilized. There's people tracks out there in different places around the world. This is a pretty interesting one. You'll see a human footprint there, and then you'll see that the dinosaur footprint stepped into the human footprint, because you see the mud wrapped around the toe, the middle toe of the dinosaur in that human footprint. So the person came there first and not the dinosaur. Here's some crisscrossing. The crisscrossing the paths, you'll see the ones going upward and to the right as dinosaur tracks. Many believe the ones coming up through the dinosaur tracks are representative of human footprints again. And they said these are around this out of Texas, Biloxi, Texas. How did we find them? There was a flood down there that pushed off all the sediment that had covered that up, washed it away, and came back down to the sedimentary rock layers and exposed the footprints in the rocks. So that's not only in Texas, that's all over the continent and around the world. Animals are rapidly buried in flood mud. If there was a massive flood that had tsunamis and rain, then you'd expect those who were covered by the sediment, it would have happened really, really fast. So in other words, they've been kind of caught in the act of doing whatever they were doing at the time they were buried. These fish were eating lunch. They didn't die and float to the surface and then decompose and fall to the bottom and get covered up. They were actually in the act of swallowing when they were buried in sediment. This one was giving birth when it was fossilized. These were all swimming in the same direction. I'd say they were fleeing the flood, but fish aren't that smart. They're probably just out swimming. You'll see there's some teenagers in the group. You see those three swimming down there by themselves? Yeah. They never go along with the crowd. Some were actually engaged in battle. This was out of Mongolia. This is a velociraptor with a protoceratops that were engaged in battle. They were encased in sandstone, and the theory among the secular scientists is that there was a giant sand dune that fell over on them. You know how that works, don't you? You've seen falling sand dunes all over the planet, right? This was a T-Rex embattling a Triceratops and they were engulfed in sediment in the middle of their battle before they even got separated. Bugs got caught in flood mud before they could decompose, and they're pretty tender and gentle. Things like butterflies and spiders are pretty soft, but they were encapsulated with the patterns on their wings and their legs on their bodies at the time they were fossilized. All kinds of critters are in that fossil record. Beetles, wasps, mosquitoes, dragonflies, birds, alligators, crabs, frogs, turtles. Yeah. It's not just dinosaurs down there in the fossils. There's fossils of all kinds of animals that exist today in the fossil record with all the other stuff. I said I can't get real deep into all that means, but we're just going to... Got seashells. One of the questions that's asked is, are there dinosaurs in the Bible? The answer to that question is yes. There are dinosaurs in the Bible. Were they on the ark? Yes. If you believe God's word, because God's word in Genesis chapter 1 says that he made everything that he made that was walking on land on day 6. Man and the animals that walked the planet, day 6. So that would mean if there were dinosaurs, living creatures that were dinosaurs, they had to be created on the same day we were. And God says that. And I'll show you as we move on. The word dragon was used when translating the Bible into English because the word dinosaur didn't yet exist. Dinosaur as a word didn't come into the human vocabulary until 1841. And the Bible's much older than that. King James Version alone was written in 1611, 200 years before the word dinosaur, to almost 250 years before the word dinosaur came into existence. The word dinosaur means terrible lizard. There was a man by the name of Sir Richard Owen, who coined the word. Only thing is, he said he saw the dinosaur bones and he said, that is a terrible lizard. But being a scientist, you don't talk in human terms. You have to find Latin or Greek or something to talk about so it looks more impressive. So they came up with 2 Greek words. That was deinos and sauros. Deinos meaning terrible and sauros meaning lizard. Of course, then it eventually got truncated down into dinosaur. Today's modern versions of the Bible, you won't see the word dinosaur now that it does exist, only because they've bought into the theory that dinosaurs were 65 million years ago, so we dare not put the word dinosaur in text where people were alive at the same time as dinosaurs, because that would be terrible. We'd look really dumb. There are more than a dozen references to dragons in the Bible. And if you see the word dragon and you put the word dinosaur in its stead, you'll see a lot of amazing things. The Bible describes where they lived, what they ate, and the sounds they made. And here's some of the passages I picked out. You see here that Micah says dragons can wail. Dragons live in the marshes, according to Isaiah 35:7, in brambles and nettles, in Isaiah 34:13. There are dragons in the sea, or dinosaurs in the sea. Some dragons lived in dens, according to Jeremiah. There were dragons that were venomous, according to the book of Deuteronomy. And there were some dragons that swallow people up. Did you ever watch Jurassic Park? Yeah. What we did learn from Jurassic Park about dinosaurs is they like Meals on Wheels. Because they ignored all the other animals on the island and went after the teeny weeny people in the Jeep. Yeah, anyway. Moving on. But if you think about it, if you think about a dinosaur being able to swallow people up, if you were a person and you have the capacity of creating weapons, and there are creatures out there that like to eat you, where do you think you'd do those creatures? What do people want to do with bears and wolves and tigers and lions? They want to get rid of them because they can eat me. Yeah, the same would have held true with the dinosaurs, those that were capable of eating you. Specific dinosaur species are noted in the Bible. God, in conversation with Job, in Job chapter 40 and 41, he tells Job specifically about Behemoth in chapter 40, Leviathan in chapter 41. When describing Behemoth, God tells Job specifically, in describing Behemoth, have you considered Behemoth, whom I made with you? See, God's telling you men and dinosaurs lived together. They didn't precede us by 65 million years. Isaiah actually speaks of flying or fiery flying serpents. Of course, those are mythological creatures, right? No. The Bible's calling straight out. When God describes these creatures, he's also talking about things like ostriches and owls and lions and mules and jackals, and they all fit right in there. God doesn't move from true animals to, let me throw in a mythological one here and there, just to keep you honest. No, God's talking about true animals the whole way through the narrative. Went too fast there. There is evidence post-flood in cultures and societies that pre-existed our own of dinosaurs. Again, dragons, we call them mythological, and we portrayed them as such. But yet there's dragon stuff all through antiquity in terms of in cultures, in writings, in art. They speak of dragons and pottery. Yeah, it's all over the world. They have what we call now dragons. But, yeah, they're actually depicting real creatures because they all have this very, very similar style in the way they portray them. You'll see some real similar ones to dinosaurs as we go through here. These are the ecostones. There's many of them. There are some fakes out there. But in the ecostones, they were created by the Nazca people in Peru, and their time on Earth was 100 BC to 800 AD. I don't know if you can see close enough on the stone to the left. There is a figure in there that looks very similar to a dinosaur that's got spots. So they actually depict it with spots. The one on the right depicts them with spots. So I would have to suspect when they were alive and walking on the planet, they had some spots on their skin. But my question would be, where did they get the imagery from? They didn't have Kodak cameras. They didn't have the internet. They had to have seen these animals in order to put them and etch them on rock, to make them look like the imagery that we actually see today with our imaginations. All we have to work with is bones, because they didn't discover dinosaur bones, really a whole skeleton at the 1800s. Then only then did they start to imagine what it might have looked like had it had flesh and muscles on those bones. Well, they were actually drawing the creatures or etching the creatures back 800 AD, 100 BC. Well, that was a pretty long time ago. In Acambaro, Mexico, they have clay figurines that I'd have to say, to me, I don't know about you, but they look a lot like dinosaurs to me. They're from the 13th century. Hey, I did that last time. Skipped over these. We'll go back here. There we go. Cambodian temple. They discovered in the jungle of Cambodia a temple that was built back in the 14th century, and carved into the stone structure were different depictions of animals, one of which that fellow's pointing at and is magnified on the left. One of those looks a heck of a lot like a stegosaurus. There are rock etchings among Indian cultures here in North America. That one on top from Canada, the two on the bottom from the Grand Canyon. Those look a lot like dinosaurs to me. Bishop Richard Bell's tomb in Carlisle Cathedral, 1496, when he died, they entombed him in the cathedral. You walk into that cathedral, there's like a brass embellishment around the spot, and you'll see two what appears to be sauropod dinosaurs with their heads locked together, one on the left with some spikes on his tail, and the one on the right, just a plain old tail. Where did they get the imagery? Still no dinosaur bones discovered at that point, yet they knew what they looked like. Could it be that they'd seen them. This is the Holy Trinity Church. This is in Georgia, not the state of Georgia, but the country of Georgia. If you look at the etchings in rock on the outside, you've got two creatures that long tails that look a heck of a lot like dinosaurs. And then it's harder to see the one that I put the box around there. There's actually a lion that's fighting against a dinosaur in battle. This is out of the Latin Book of Hours. That was from 1840 AD, 15th century. Shows St. George slaying a dragon, which by size and color, based on the bones we've now found, they associate that with an Ankylosaurus. Of course, what did they call it? They called it a dragon. Dinosaur as a word didn't exist in the 15th century. This is how the Church of St. Louis of the French in Rome. That church was completed in 1580. On the left, you'll see what appears to be some form of a lizard type of animal, dinosaur-like. And in the artwork to the right, that's a little harder to see, but you'll see the foot down there toward the kind of the bottom left, and you'll see the arching snake-like spikes on its back going up to its head, and you'll see its tail then disappearing into the brush, so that it's very dinosaur-like in appearance. And then you'll notice hiding in the brush on the right side of the screen about midway up, there's a baby one in there. How did they know what they looked like? This is a Nile mosaic of Palestrina. This was taken out of Pompeii, that city in Rome that was wiped out by the volcanic activity and frozen in time. You'll notice on the bottom right, you'll see somebody actually sitting in the back of an animal that appears to be a dinosaur. One to the left, you might say it's a crocodile, or it could be a dinosaur. So we see it in all this artistry. They also wrote stories about them. Alexander the Great in the 12th century was in India. And while in India, I don't know if you can read the font that small, but while I'm talking, if you want to attempt to read it, you can go for it. But when he returned, he told the story of what they'd done there, and there's a Roman author named Claudius Aelianus, if I pronounce his name correctly, or Lianus, or I don't know. But he talked about a creature that when he was going through India, there was a creature living there that the people of India worshipped because it was big and powerful. And we know the people in India have worshipped things like cows and other types of things as well. They consider them sacred. So they pleaded with Alexander and his army not to kill that creature. So as they were passing by this creature's lair, I guess they made enough noise as an army that the creature actually came out and actually hissed and growled at them as they went by. And they measured it in cubits. It was reported to measure 70 cubits, which in our measurement or unit measurement would go about 105 feet long. Marco Polo was traveling abroad in 1271 through India and China. And while he was there, he actually chronicled his trip. And in chronicling his trip, he spoke of serpents that he saw. He described them as serpents because he had no other name to give to them. But they described their feet as being like a lion or the claw of a bird's foot. And they moved themselves, and they said they were so big and so heavy that when they moved across the ground, they would create a furrow with their tail as they would move along. Of course, they were a threat because they said they had multiple teeth. So they were a threat to the people, so the people would try and kill them because they said they would come out at night and hunt. And their method for killing them said to be this detailed about the process. You can tell he's not talking about a mythical creature. They're actually trying to hunt it. They would take and they would bury steel blades in the soil where it would travel out of its thing, and then they knew where to come back. They could follow the trail, and they would bury these steel things knowing that the weight of the creature would be sufficient that it would go back down in the soil and it would slice the creature open and kill it. And that's how they found ways to eliminate it. So that's all documented by Marco Polo. So when you think about evolutionary theory, a large percentage of Christians out there now have bought into the evolutionary theory. Again, it's atheistic. Creatures evolved on their own. God wasn't involved. And if God isn't involved, there's no sin. If there's no sin, then Jesus wasn't a savior. He was just a prophet. He just did wonderful things. That undermines the whole Christian faith. But what the Bible tells us about ourselves, God says you are fearfully and wonderfully made. You didn't come from a monkey. You don't have any broccoli in your ancestry. You are fearfully and wonderfully made. You're the apple of God's eye. He considers you his treasure. He loved you enough that he would pay the highest price he had in everything that he had. His own son, sitting on the throne, would come and give his life on your behalf to save you from the sin and how it has ravaged the human race. Why did he send a flood? Because sin had ravaged the human race then, and you'll read there in the Genesis narrative that when he just decided to send the flood, it said because he grieved him at his heart to see the sinfulness of mankind. God's sending another judgment. He's sending fire this time. He's going to destroy everything he made, the heavens and the earth. And according to 1 Peter chapter 3, he actually tells us that he's long-suffering toward us, not willing that any should perish, but that all come to repentance. Why is evolution pushed so hard to kids in schools? It's not an intellectual thing. It's not a political thing. It's a spiritual thing. Convince the kids that there's no God. Satan himself knows his final judgment is the lake of fire. And he's out to do everything he can against the God who made him because he wants to be like him. And if he can't, he's going to try and destroy everything God made. That includes you. He wants to see you judged. He wants you to spend eternity with him. He wants to grieve God's heart as a way of getting back to God. So he's going to push this narrative in the schools, in the colleges. Why, if you think about it, outside of that, why is it important to know whether dinosaurs lived millions of years ago? Why does that even matter to anybody? What happened millions of years ago? But it does matter that God sent his son to die for you. It does matter that you sinned against a holy God. It does matter whether or not you accept Jesus as your Savior and make him Lord of your life so that you can be spared from God's wrath. That matters. So don't buy into the lie. The Bible is true. It's accurate. You can test it so many different ways and will always prove itself to be true. Geographically, historically, scientifically, the Bible has the story in there. So don't buy into the lie. I guess with that, I'll come to an end.
All right, thank you so much. We'll go ahead and we'll dismiss, but if you guys keep Pastor and Bethany in your prayers this week as they're doing some hard labor up in Maine, but just pray for them to keep them sustained while they work and do stuff, and to have some safe travels because they're coming back on Saturday evening to be here for Sunday. So you guys go ahead and enjoy your day. The sun is shining. It's nice out. Enjoy your families. And if